Very much, Gary. I'm going to have my phone up here, speaking of technologies, so I can keep track of how much time I've used, because I don't want to be publicly humiliated by IPSIT. Although I do think that's a great idea. So just to, many of you may have seen our mission symbol here and wondered what the heck it represents. It's just sort of squiggly lines, but this is a human head on the left-hand side and really a Florence flask on the right-hand side, although I tell most non-science audiences that that's a beaker. And but since you're a science audience, you'll recognize that it's not. And the idea here is just to say that we are providing care and support for people who currently have Alzheimer's and other dementias, but we're also focused on ending dementia, and the way that we're going to get there is through biomedical research. I also want to make a point here, just a quick PSA for any of you who may be dealing with Alzheimer's or another dementia in your family. Although we go publicly by the Alzheimer's Association, we actually provide care and support services and fund research into all of the causes of dementia. So if you are looking for help, we are here for you, regardless of whether the dementia is due to Alzheimer's or due to something else. Just briefly about the impact, Gary mentioned we have millions of baby boomers now who are entering the age of increased risk for developing Alzheimer's and other dementias. And even today, there are more than 5 million Americans with Alzheimer's that has already progressed to the dementia stage, and we expect that number to increase to nearly 14 million by 2050 if we don't have some important medical breakthroughs. That is obviously not affecting just the people with the disease, but also affecting their families. There are more than 16 million Americans providing unpaid care and support. These tend to be children, they tend to be spouses, family, friends, et cetera. So 16 million Americans, that's an enormous impact. It is the 6th leading cause of death in the United States. That's according to death certificate numbers that are compiled by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And they've actually made the point that if you lump in some of the other diseases that lead to dementia as well, that it would actually be the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. All of that comes at tremendous cost. It's the costliest disease in America. This year, we are spending $290 billion caring for people with Alzheimer's and other dementias. And these are hard costs. This is someone gets a bill, someone else pays the bill. Money is changing hands. About 2/3 of this is covered by Medicare and Medicaid. So we're all on the hook for this, not just the families who are affected. And again, as that prevalence increases due to the baby boomers now moving into that age of increased risk, we do expect that by 2050, this will increase to over $1 trillion per year. So just some quick terminology. Dementia is, and speaking of the prevalence, if you are 65 and older, it's about 1 in 10 Americans has Alzheimer's disease, and if you're 85 and older, it's about 1 in 3. So a huge wave is coming with the increase in Alzheimer's cases. So just a little bit of terminology. A lot of people are confused about dementia versus Alzheimer's disease. How do they relate to one another? Briefly speaking, dementia is a clinical syndrome that relates to problems in cognitive domains that has become bad enough that it begins to interfere with your activities of daily living. It is not the same thing as normal age-related cognitive decline, which almost all of us are experiencing, but it's going to be caused by some specific underlying brain disease, in many people actually more than one underlying neuropathology. Now, one of the things that won't be lost on this audience, but is lost on a lot of audiences, unfortunately, is that cognition is not the only problem in dementia. You also have behavioral and psychiatric symptoms of dementia, or BPSD. We sometimes refer to these as the non-cognitive symptoms of dementia. And these are extremely disruptive and bothersome, both to the patient, but also to their family members. So as an example, somewhere between 20 and 50% of people with dementia have agitation, very common behavioral and psychiatric symptom, and this is known to contribute actually to early placement in nursing homes before the person might otherwise need to be placed due simply to their cognitive symptoms. These are the currently approved FDA therapies, or FDA approved therapies. All of these are for these cognitive symptoms. None of these are for the psychiatric symptoms, unfortunately. We have seen recently pimavanserin actually just concluded a clinical trial that was stopped early for ethical reasons because it was so successful, and so we may actually have a medication for psychosis in dementia in the near future, but we do not yet. So how does technology fit into all of this? Well, I'm going to tell a quick story about how technology has changed our understanding of the disease. And so this is Alois Alzheimer on the left, and then August Dieter in the middle. The physician who first described Alzheimer's disease, obviously, and then his patient who was the first person described to have Alzheimer's disease. If there was any justice in the world, we might call this Dieter's disease, but then as now, there isn't that much justice in the world, and so we call it Alzheimer's disease. I guess he deserves some credit, but she was the first person described. And what he saw in her brain, this was due to a revolution in technology at that time. This was 1906. There were better microscopes, there were better staining techniques that were being developed at that time. And so Dr. Alzheimer was able to see something that had never been seen before. And these are now the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, specifically the amyloid plaques and the tau tangles. As well as neurodegeneration, which could be seen prior to that shrinkage of the brain, but it wasn't until you could see the amyloid plaques and the tau tangles that this became specific for Alzheimer's disease. Now I'm going to actually skip a slide here and come back to it, as I had two of my slides out of order. But there's a continuum of cognitive impairment, and this was really holding up progress in the field for a long time because you couldn't tell who had these plaques and tangles until people passed away. So you had to find people to be in your research studies based strictly on their clinical syndrome. And of course, because there's normal age-related cognitive decline as well as pathological cognitive impairment, it can be very difficult to find, to determine where does a person diverge from what's normal and is now showing signs of what is abnormal. So going back a couple of slides, or one slide, here we go. So this technology was developed about 15 years ago, and what you're seeing here is amyloid PET imaging, and this was the first time we were able to see who had these plaques in the brain during life. So you no longer had to wait until people passed in order to tell who had dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. More than that, this can be used predictively because it turns out the amyloid plaques begin to build up in the brain about 20 years, maybe more, before dementia symptoms set in. More recently, we now have PET imaging not only for amyloid, but also now in research use for tau, as well as for early stages of atrophy. And so you don't have to wait until the atrophy is bad enough that you can see it on MRI. All of those technologies have led to really the way in which we think about this disease. And so in the old days, you were over here on the right-hand side, and you had to wait until a person really developed dementia symptoms before you could place them in a clinical trial or other research study for Alzheimer's. And you were basing that on medical history, cognitive testing, and by the way, you were wrong many, many times. So if you look back at the old clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, people who've been followed to autopsy, 25 to 30% of the time, those folks, it turns out, didn't actually have Alzheimer's pathology in their brain. So their dementia symptoms were really caused by something else, Lewy body disease, vascular disease, et cetera. And that's how we've ended up with all of these symptomatic medications, which, thank goodness we have them, but what we really want are disease-modifying medications. Well, with the advent of these biomarkers, we've now been able to start clinical trials much earlier, and it's actually now a reality that there are clinical trials happening in people who have what researchers refer to as preclinical Alzheimer's disease. So people who have amyloid in the brain, maybe they have some tau in the brain, but they're not yet showing any clinical symptoms. So this begins to look a little bit like heart disease does today. Is there a biomarker we can test, like we test cholesterol, find the right people who need treatment, and then give them a disease-modifying therapy? Well, we don't have that disease-modifying therapy yet, although, of course, Biogen announced about a week ago, I guess now, that they are going to submit aducanumab to the FDA for approval, which, if it's approved, would be the first disease-modifying medication for Alzheimer's disease. So I think this is how the field has changed. But now, of course, we have a lot of new technologies, the apps, the wearables, the Internet of Things. And I think there is tremendous opportunity now for these technologies to help us get even earlier and earlier in identifying people who are at risk for developing dementia, especially non-Alzheimer's dementia, where we don't have as many biomarkers as we do for Alzheimer's dementia. So what can we do down in this area using technology where we don't yet have the biomarkers? Well, one of the things is this concept of mild behavioral impairment, getting back to this concept that there's more than just cognition going wrong in dementia. So this was a recently developed concept which is similar to mild cognitive impairment, but some psychiatrists are telling us that these mild behavioral impairments may actually be a better precursor for determining who's going to develop dementia than the mild cognitive impairment. So this MBI checklist was developed in the last few years, but of course all of that could be done through technology as well. You can imagine using a person's phone to pick up their speaking patterns, how people are doing with word choice, is their vocabulary decreasing, et cetera. To pick up on things such as mild cognitive impairment and mild behavioral impairment much earlier than you could with a paper and pencil test. Second to last slide, just earlier this month, the NIH announced the winners of their iCare-AD ADRD Eureka challenge, which was specifically looking to reward people who are doing interesting things with technology to help us with care as well. So you can go sort of all the way to sort of the left-hand side of the graph to earliest possible detection, all the way out to the farthest right-hand side of the graph, which is what can we do with people who already have dementia to make their lives better and their caregivers as well. So I see these as being some of the areas of opportunity for technology as we move forward. All right, and I didn't get the stop sign, so thanks very much.